Margaret Housman, and I live in Barnstable Village. The best memories I have are very personal. Many, many years ago, my husband and I made our first trip to Cape Cod on our honeymoon, and we fell in love with it. We stayed in the town of Barnstable. We toured all over the Cape. And then a few years later, we actually bought a second home in Barnstable Village, which we have now considered home for more than 30 years, even though we lived in New Jersey for many of those years. For the last 10 years, we've been in Barnstable Village full time and feel very much a part of the village and love being there. We are Congregationalists, and over the years have either been members of a Presbyterian church or a Congregational church. And when we came to the Cape full-time, we visited West Barnstable and the West Parish Church, and were immediately struck by the wonderful minister and his sermons and the welcoming congregation. And it was no question in our mind. You're right. Yes. Interestingly, the West Parish congregation, not the structure, but the congregation, dates way back to 1616, when the group of people organized under a minister by the name of Henry Jacob. They worshipped in secret at the time because it was the period of English history when the Anglican Church was in control. Then when Henry Jacob left, and actually left to go to Virginia, the congregation was then led by John Lothrop. And that is, of course, the name that is intricately associated with the history of Barnstable. And John Lothrop was imprisoned along with 42 of his followers when they were found to be meeting in secret and having worship services, which was, of course, illegal at the time. He was imprisoned for 2 years and then was allowed to leave prison provided he emigrated to the New World. And so John Lothrop and 42 of his followers left England and sailed to the New World with a group on the Griffin, a ship called the Griffin. They arrived in Scituate first, and then 5 years later, in 1639, arrived in Barnstable and settled in Barnstable. 22 families came at that point. When John Lothrop arrived in 1639 with the followers, there were some other people here in Barnstable, of course. The very first service was held in what is today West Barnstable and is marked by a plaque at a location called Sacrament Rock. It's directly across from one of the entrances to the West Barnstable Elementary School. And in October 1639, the first service was held there and the first communion service. And significantly, when the group came over in 1634 on the Griffin, they did bring with them their sacramental vessels, pewterware, communionware, and these were actually used at the first service in 1639, and they are still in the possession of the West Parish Church. It is now at Sturgis Library. And interestingly, it's a 1605 Bible, which John Lothrop brought with him on the Griffin again. And there's interestingly an anecdote, well, it's not an anecdote, a story that goes with it, because apparently he was reading one night, and of course was reading by candlelight, and some wax dripped and pages were burned. And the story is that he was able to not only restore the pages, but actually write in the text as well for the missing parts that had been burned. That Bible in 1957, after many years coming through Lothrop family descendants, was given to Sturgis Library. And it is now on display in a wonderfully climate-controlled glass case in Sturgis Library, appropriately named the Lothrop Room, which is the first room where services were actually held, or I shouldn't say first room, it was the second home of John Lothrop. And in that home, in that room, not only was he living in that house, but they had services there as well. So it's very significant. (1717) is the construction, or marks the decision, to build the church, or the meeting house, more appropriately called the meeting house. The community had grown quite large by that time, and the decision was made to separate into an East Parish and a West Parish. And on property in the West Parish, property that had been owned by the Crocker family, that is where the West Parish meeting house was built. And then the East Parish was located over where today's Unitarian Church is on Cobb Hill. The original structure in 1717 held the first services 2 years later when the meeting house was constructed. And so for all of those years, from 1717 up through the Revolution and long after, it was a significant building in the history of Barnstable. It was not only a meeting house where town meetings were held, but Tories and patriots debated, should we join the Revolution prior to the war? It was also the site of a school. James Otis, Mercy Otis Warren, well-known names in the history of Barnstable, attended school in what was the West Parish Meeting House. And so that is the origin of it, so to speak. It also was the location of the very first Barnstable High School for a few years. All of the colonial town meetings were held in the West Parish Meeting House. Okay, let's go back a little bit. In the mid-19th century, in the 1850s, the congregation had dwindled quite a bit, and they did not have the money to build a new building. So what they did was change the structure and really make it in the neoclassical style. The old sheep pens were removed, a new ceiling was put in, all of the pews were turned around. Effectively, they changed the look. And then in the 1920s, that is when the beginnings of the wishes of Elizabeth Crocker Jenkins became known. And she was a guiding force in what we call the Restoration. And the Restoration was really completed in the late 1950s. So really between 53 and 58, the Restoration took place. And the goal was to restore the building to its original state as it had been back in 1717. And the amazing thing was, in the 1850s, many of the components of the building had just left and been put in other West Barnstable homes. And when the Restoration occurred, we had sufficient information to know about the windows, the pens. There was enough to go on that Elizabeth Crocker Jenkins, the architect, and then the subsequently created West Parish Memorial Foundation were able to reconstruct pretty much according to how it had been in 1717, with a couple of exceptions where things would be copied. But it became one of the finest examples of colonial ecclesiastical architecture dating from 1717. And in its restored state, it is a treasure. And it is part of the National Registry, which includes all of that section along 149. So much so that changes cannot be made to it if it does not comply with, say, 1717. Now, there are a few exceptions. We do have heat in the winter. We don't have air conditioning in the summer, but we do have heat in the winter. We have no running water. We use Jenkins Hall, which is the fellowship hall across the Teardrop, where the family school is. We use that for facilities and for meetings and things. And so the meeting house is very much as it was in 1717. Particularly the Paul Revere Bell, the grant that and it is no longer the West Parish Memorial Foundation. It has now been renamed the 1717 Meeting House Foundation, so as to not have confusion with the West Parish Church. It was seen as a way to simplify the distinction, one being secular and the other being religious. The grant will enable the foundation to, you can use the word restore, and to maintain certain parts of the meeting house. The bell, the Paul Revere studio, I believe it was in 1806 that the Paul Revere bell came to the congregation. And that is almost a ton. It's about 900 and some odd pounds. And over the years, it's the cradle that it's in has needed repair. And so that is one of the main things that's going to get done. The roof, for many of you, if you drive by 149, you will have noticed there was a big green tarp on the roof for many months. A new roof is included in that, and a number of other projects that the foundation has deemed necessary for really the survival down over the years, through the years, of the meeting house. The rooster, and I guess many people in town know it as the Rooster Church, which is something I learned long after joining the church. And the rooster actually came in 1723 from England and has been atop the tower of that church all these years. So it's very much a symbol of that West Parish building. The building itself is the history, really, in terms of the town of Barnstable. The congregation is, in fact, since it dates from 1616, the oldest congregational group in existence today. And that gives it not only history, but you have this knowledge that men, women, children, through the ages, have been part of this congregational line. And what's very significant for us in the church is that in 2016, we will be celebrating our 400th anniversary as a congregation, an unbroken line, which is tremendously exciting and also very significant. And in many ways, you could almost say the history of the church is the history of Barnstable, and that the two are interrelated. So we are celebrating 375 in Barnstable town, but 400th is coming up for the church. And so they have kind of marched in step over all these years. So personally, that's very exciting. Not only to be part of it, but also to be a part of the congregational tradition, which we value. I'm Margaret Housman, and it has been my pleasure to talk with you about the history of the West Parish Church and the history of Barnstable. Thank you.